I'm going to talk to you a bit today about this book, The Zen Teachings of Huang Po, which was not the first book I ever read on Zen, but it was really the first book that drove home to me what Zen is all about in a really visceral way. I mean, I first got interested in Buddhism when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old from reading Will Durant's Story of Civilization, this big, multi-volume history book my parents had. It had the history of Buddhism, which was intriguing to me and caused me to dig further into some of the textbooks my mom was bringing home because she was doing graduate work in Chinese history at the time. She was more focused on 20th century history. What was intriguing to me, though, was just the whole way of thinking that, inner peace and harmony and sort of going with the flow of the broader universe somehow was more profoundly important than achieving and building things or even than getting intellectual understanding, because my orientation as a really geeky little kid was more focused on understanding the world and science and math and thinking, whereas according to Buddhism and the Zen perspective, thinking is sort of a digression from fundamental well-being. I got a little more into this direction in middle school when I started reading the Russian mystic Uspensky, and I spent a bunch of 6th and 7th grade like trying to be maximally aware of myself and maximally awake at all times, rather than sort of drifting into habitual patterns of thinking when you were kind of oblivious and not acutely aware of what's going on, just being an automaton. I didn't want to be an automaton. That certainly got me through a lot of boring classes in middle school, just being mindful and intensely aware of everything. I remember, I think it was 8th grade, I was often sent to after school detention by the teachers and the vice principal, usually for either being late to school or for reading in class. I mean, it was kind of classic. I'd be sitting in pre-algebra class or something, reading a calculus book, and then I'd get sent to detention for not paying attention to the teacher, right? So, but when I was in detention, I was supposed to be sitting there in the chair, just looking straight ahead and not reading, writing, not doing anything, just waiting the 45 minutes till I was let out. So I would sit in lotus position and just, empty my mind and try to sink into cosmic awareness, which drove the teachers monitoring the detention nuts, because they wanted me to be unhappy. I was just like, cool, it's a free meditation class after school every day under the name of detention. Thanks. That Uspensky was interesting to me, and it sort of guided me to a certain type of meditation, but his theories were really complex and crazy, and I didn't want to accept all of them. There was a lot of interesting stuff there. I read Gödel, Escher, Bach a little later than that. I think I was about 14 years old, which was Douglas Hofstadter's book on artificial intelligence. And actually that was the first book that pointed me into the academic AI literature. I mean, before that, I'd known AI from science fiction and from futurist books like Gerald Feinberg's Prometheus Project, but I hadn't really had an opening to go into what were current researchers writing about AI. This was a 1979-80, and reading Gödel, Escher, Bach told me like what books to look at in the Rutgers University library, which I had access to through my dad. But along the way, Hofstadter's book contains some discussion of Zen koans, like, well, what is the sound of one hand clapping, right? And that intrigued me in the way Hofstadter was tying that in with mathematical logic and systems theory and all sorts of other things. He was talking about, a strange loop, like in this sentence is false, or the Goertzel sentence, say this statement is unprovable in this formal system, or, this self model, which tries to model Ben Goertzel, this this self model is not an accurate model of itself, right? So you have these strange loops, these recursive constructs, and he was viewing a paradox like, what is the sound of one hand clapping, or empty your mind of all thinking so that you can really understand that there is no understanding, right? He was using these sorts of paradoxes as a way to connect Eastern thinking with mathematical logic, with AI, with complex systems theory. To be honest, I wasn't able to untangle all the threads that Hofstadter was tying together, but it intrigued me and sort of primed me for finding this book a few years later, which has a lot of stuff that's perplexing from the point of view of the standard Western scientific and logical mind. So let me just read a couple brief passages here. Question: what guidance does your reverence offer to those of us who find all this very difficult to understand? Answer: I have no thing to offer. I have never had anything to offer others. It's because you allow certain people to lead you astray that you're forever seeking intuition and searching for understanding. Isn't this a case of disciples and teachers all falling into the same insoluble muddle? All you need to remember are the following injunctions. First, learn how to be entirely unreceptive to sensations arising from external forms, thereby purging your bodies of receptivity to externals. Second, learn not to pay attention to any distinctions between this and that arising from your sensations, thereby purging your bodies of useless discernments between one phenomenon and another. Third, take great care to avoid discriminating in terms of pleasant and unpleasant sensations, thereby purging your bodies of vain discriminations. And fourth, avoid pondering things in your mind, thereby purging your bodies of discriminatory cognition. A single moment's dualistic thought is sufficient to drag you back to the 12-fold chain of causation. It's ignorance that turns the wheel of causation, thereby creating an endless chain of karmic causes and results. And this is the law that governs our whole lives up to the time of senility and death. So if you want to escape, the chain of causation, the chain of dependent origination that keeps you trapped in a suboptimal state of consciousness, stop all sensation, stop all thinking, stop all discrimination, and just bask in the pearly nothingness of the void. Another classic passage. Question: the sixth patriarch was illiterate. How is it that he was handed the robe that elevated him to that office? Elder Shen Xiu, some other rival candidate, occupied a position above 500 others and was able to expound 32 volumes of sutras. Why did he not receive the robe instead? So why did this illiterate guy get, promoted to a high level of Zen priesthood and not someone who had a lot of knowledge? Answer: because Elder Shen Xiu still indulged in conceptual thought in the Dharma of activity. To him, as you practice, so shall you attain was a reality. So the fifth patriarch made the transmission to Hui Neng. At that very moment, when he received the transmission, he attained a tacit understanding and received in silence the profoundest thought of the Tathagata. That's why the Dharma was transmitted to him. So the guy who learned a lot from books, he didn't quite have it. The guy who got this sort of wordless, ineffable transmission of knowledge, he got the true understanding. You do not see that the fundamental doctrine of the Dharma is that there are no Dharmas, yet that this doctrine of no Dharma is in itself a Dharma. And now that the no Dharma doctrine has been transmitted, how can the doctrine of the Dharma be a Dharma? Whoever understands the meaning of this deserves to be called a monk, one skilled at Dharma practice. Now, if you look at the Chinese, a word-to-word translation will be a bit more like, Dharma, original Dharma, not Dharma, not Dharma, Dharma, also Dharma. Now transmit, not Dharma, Dharma, not Dharma, Dharma, also Dharma. Dharma, Dharma, how can be Dharma? I think I screwed that up, but hey, you can look at the book. So, I read that and I felt, in a sense, I actually did understand it. I could parse out all the references and all the nested function calls and so forth. On the other hand, what it's telling you is that if you understand it, if you manage to parse through all that and figure out what it means, you're on the wrong track, because understanding is not what it's after anyway. It's something that's quite complex to understand. And once you parse it, it's telling you that that understanding itself is leading you astray. So that's the Douglas Hofstadter strange loop, right? Which is intriguing and also a bit, baffling and perplexing. And if you'd explored psychedelics, which I had by the time I first encountered this book, you probably found yourself exploring a bunch of those strange loops in a very experiential sense. Like, oh my God, I don't exist. Well, but how can I be here thinking that I don't exist if I don't exist? Well, because this thinking doesn't exist. And then you keep going around and around and around and around. So what do I really make of this now? I mean, it's a fascinating and amazing body of practice and experience and culture. And I think that achieving a state of consciousness where you're not attached to sensations and cognitions and discriminations is that's a valuable and profound thing. So I mean, if you meditate a lot, you can get in a state of consciousness where the perceptions are there, but they just kind of drift past and you're not attached to them, and your thoughts are there and the thoughts are happening, but they also kind of drift past without you becoming attached to them or clinging to them or worrying if they're going to stay around or drift past. And sort of the same thing with emotions, right? And then, I mean, you don't bother to ask yourself, is the thought really my thought or not? Am I really there or not? Was that sensation there a moment ago or not? I mean, you don't bother to question those distinctions. The stuff is just kind of there or not there or whatever. And when you get into this state of consciousness, there's generally the sense of extraordinary well-being and a sort of oneness with the background field of consciousness or existence that all these thoughts, perceptions, selves, and whatnot are nebulously drifting around in. Now it's a fascinating state of consciousness to get into, and some people are in that state of consciousness in a very intense way all the time, and some of these people who are in this state of consciousness in a very intense way all the time, they still manage to do really interesting things in the world while they're not attached and blissed out. So I'm certainly not I'm not a super enlightened Zen master like Huang Po. I'm not certain that I aspire to be. I think I've had a few consciousness transitions in my life that have brought me closer to that state than I was when I was considerably younger. Really, in my consciousness now, there's a lot less attachment to things, being perceptions, thoughts, emotions, or whatnot, and more of an identification with a sort of background of consciousness and well-being in which thoughts, perceptions, and so forth are playing around. One thing that's become clear to me is there's a really wide variety of states of consciousness that are beyond the sort of highly attached and habituated state of consciousness most people are in most of the time. And I'll discuss this in another video sometime soon. My friend Jeffrey Martin published a very cool book called The Finders, which partly summarizes some interviews he did over many years, studying a lot of different people in various, non-ordinary states of consciousness characterized by a feeling of extraordinary well-being. And what Jeffrey found is there's a lot of diversity in these states of consciousness, and the extraordinary states of consciousness that a Zen genius like Huang Po is directing you toward. These are valid, they're amazing, they're fascinating, and they're not the only sort of extraordinary state of consciousness out there. So I mean, I definitely recommend this book. I wish I could read it in the original Chinese, but even in the English translation, it's fascinating, and it's sort of a guidebook to certain experiential practices that are quite remote from our everyday lives today. And it's important to see what exciting, outlandish, joyous, paradoxical states of consciousness the human brain, body, culture are capable of. Once you open your mind to the diversity of possible consciousness states, I mean, then in a way that makes things clear, in a way that it makes them more confusing, right? It makes clear that the way we experience ourselves and our worlds in everyday life is a teeny tiny corner, even of the set of possible consciousness states that the legacy human brain and body are capable of, let alone what we might do once we expand the brain and body or mind upload or whatever. And that's a important clarity to have. The confusion is, there's so many, just like there's so many religions out there. I mean, even when you get beyond superstitious aspect of religions, there's just validly so many different consciousness states beyond the one we're in normally in our everyday routine lives out there. And, which one to advance yourself toward, if any, is a quite subtle, intriguing thing. How much more subtle and intriguing it will get once we, can radically modify the human brain and body, and the scope of possibilities will be even more. So to tie this into artificial intelligence a bit, just very briefly, that the scope of different wisdom traditions and their descriptions of different advanced states of consciousness, this should be considered part of the requirement spec for human level AGI. I mean, what we're after with human level AGI, it's not just simulating the mind of a Walmart greeter or someone typing at the cash register while they're at work. It's not just simulating the mind of, say, a laboratory scientist when they're doing experiments and looking patterns in their data, or a Wall Street trader. I mean, we're human level AGI means really, making it an AI that's capable of the whole spectrum of intelligences that humanity is capable of, right? And when you look at, say, the multiple intelligences theory, where you have a variety of types of intelligence, like a mathematical intelligence, verbal intelligence, musical intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, emotional intelligence, so forth. There's something called existential intelligence, which is included in that list, which has to do with sort of the profound spiritual relationship between your experience, yourself, the world around you. And this is part of the requirement spec for human level AGI. And you could, you could debate the qualia problem in various ways. You could say, well, a digital computer doesn't have any experience, but I don't think that's very compelling, because to me, if I'm in a more profound sort of enlightened-ish state of mind, everything appears to be everything is part of a field of experience. This cup is part of the field of experience, and a digital computer is part of the field of experience. And it's no more my place to say that the universal field of consciousness is not manifested in a certain software program or computer device. That's no more mine to say than that the universal field of consciousness is not manifested in some other person that I'm talking to. I think the question really becomes, can you configure a piece of software controlling a piece of hardware so that that software can contact the same breadth of states of consciousness that people have, and more so, right? Because the breadth of conscious states that the human brain can resonate with, that is probably a small fraction of the breadth of conscious states that transhuman AGIs or cyborgs could resonate with. In any case, I've gone quite far afield, as is my inclination, but I would recommend you to read and reflect on this little book, and see where it leads you, both intellectually and trans-intellectually, in terms of exploring the universe beyond thought.